Heaven sent.
Throughout my research of some of the most influential gaming studios of all time, there's one certain company that has piqued my interest ever since I was a child. And growing up in the late 90s to early 2000s, I've been around to bear witness to the many controversies in movies and gaming at the time. You see, digital media was on a steady rise in popularity, with gaming becoming more popular than ever before. And when it came to atrocities in our world being committed, many news outlets were quick to point the blame on the entertainment industry for having a negative impact on the minds of our youth. They believed that violent and profane content in digital media were steadily manipulating the suggestive brains of an entire generation, molding them to be dangerous and defiant. And at the forefront of blame within the gaming industry, Rockstar Games had held the spotlight of controversy for many years to come. This is a studio that has both created some of the most loved and despised series of all time, and are one of the few development studios that have had no problem in pushing the envelope and taking their game's content to a whole new level of depravity. And while we're a bit desensitized with the wild array of distasteful games in present day, back at the explosion of Rockstar's success, it was always a question as to what kind of debauchery they could come up with next. So in this video, I thought it'd be fun to look back on the wild history of Rockstar Games, covering some of their most infamous controversies, as well as the incredible series they came to release. And with a name that's more than fit for sex, drugs, and rock and roll, join me as we take an in-depth look at Rockstar Studios, the bad boys of gaming. Now before we get into the nitty-gritty world of Rockstar Games, let's take an overseas trip back to London, England in the early 1970s. Our story begins with two brothers by the names of Sam and Dan Houser. Their mother, Geraldine Moffat, was a credited film and television actress, which gave the boys an interest in film at a very young age. They were particularly fond of crime-based films, with 1972 bank heist thriller The Getaway being one of Sam's personal favorites. Quite ironic, isn't it? But once they had gotten older, the brothers decided to take a part-time job at a media company by the name of BMG, which eventually led to them working with DMA Design on an upcoming video game titled Race and Chase. The game featured a top-down perspective in which players would essentially run from the police in an open-world setting, with 2D characters and 3D environments. But after the game was plagued with a coding glitch, causing the NPC police cruisers to repeatedly ram themselves into the player, the Houser brothers took note of this and decided to turn the game into something even more ambitious. Sam Houser was a huge fan of the space trading game Elite, a game that allowed players the freedom to accept missions on the fly and explore an open world setting. They wanted to take the original concept of Race and Chase and combine the open playing structure of Elite in order to create a game unlike anything ever seen before. Players would be able to enter and exit any vehicle they choose, as well as a variety of weapons and areas to explore. And with a whole new concept for the game coming to fruition, the name was officially changed to Grand Theft Auto. And so began the highly successful GTA series. The game was originally developed for the MS-DOS operating system, but later came to be ported to Windows and PlayStation. Being met with critical acclaim and becoming a best-selling title in the UK had brought the Houser boys and DMA the commercial success they were looking for. But with the game's content being so heavily reliant on committing crimes and causing mayhem, there was plenty of public outrage from the media and government officials. The game was swiftly banned in Brazil due to its depiction of reckless driving and violence, and rather than pulling back, they decided to use such controversy as a way to market their game. And boy, did it work. They hired a notorious publicist at the time, Max Clifford, to basically stir the pot and get the media outlets talking about the game. And while the story of Max didn't age too well over time, the creators of GTA are still in agreement that the game never could have been met with such exposure without the help of his marketing techniques. Just a year after the release of the original GTA, Take-Two Interactive had made an acquisition deal with BMG, in which Take-Two exchanged 16% of its common stock for a handful of BMG's IPs. One of these IPs were the Grand Theft Auto license, and with the success of its first entry, they decided it was time to develop its sequel. Take-Two then arranged for the Houser brothers, among others, to find a new division under their name, which eventually became Rockstar Games. Rockstar was initially just a publishing company under Take-Two, with DMA still handling the development side of the new GTA, but Sam and Dan were adamant on staying heavily involved with the game's production, and safe to say, they were on the right track. The infamous GTA 2 intro cutscene was based on a screenplay written by Dan Houser himself, and was an iconic piece of media for its time, giving us a foreshadowed look into the character of Claude Speed. This cutscene was a super sick intro, and did an amazing job at hyping its players for what's to come in the new game. This is a game that I spent a whole lot of time playing as a kid, and I even remember searching for a cheat code to make it completely three-dimensional at one point. I never found one, but luckily enough, that dream will be right around the corner. But going back to the release of GTA 2, the game was met with a fairly disappointing reception. Many critics were claiming that the game had little to no additions to offer, with most of the praises being directed at the game's soundtrack. This came to be disappointing news for the newly formed Rockstar, as they were hoping to make GTA the next big thing in gaming. So they took their efforts back to the drawing board and decided it was time to rethink things. But before we get to that, let's take a little detour into a whole new IP they were looking to publish, as it's one you're sure to be fond of. So get ready to fasten your seatbelts and punch some gears. It's time to join the club. Few video game genres could ever compete with the aesthetic beauty found within the many racing IPs of the early 2000s. From charming aesthetics of the Ridge Racer series to the smooth and beautiful racing simulations of Gran Turismo, racing games were giving their players an ambiance that was found to be captivating to the senses. But upon the new millennium, the trend of souped-up import cars and vehicle mods were sweeping the scene in a heavy fashion, bringing a whole new era for fans of high speeds and giving video game enthusiasts a desire for something a bit more edgy. Around this time, a game called Midtown Madness made its way onto the Windows PC, was redefining the racing genre in ways that were hard to find. Rather than restricting its players to a linear path, they opted for making the game's settings into an open-world recreation of Chicago, giving players an unprecedented amount of freedom. And with these ambitious efforts, Midtown Madness was quickly making waves in the gaming community. The game's development team, Angel Studios, were reaping the rewards of their hard work, with many critics and players alike praising the game for its open-ended nature. Taking notice of their success, Rockstar Games have reached out to Angel Studios in hopes that they would develop two of their upcoming releases for the PS2, one being Smuggler's Run, and the second being our very topic of discussion. And upon them coming to an agreement in this collaboration, so began the inception of one of the greatest street racing IPs of all time. The popularity of racing culture in the early 2000s were on a steady rise, with a litany of films, music, and magazines promoting the speed-driven lifestyle. And with the team at Rockstar having somewhat of an affinity for menacing activities in their games, it only made sense for them to create a title revolving around illegal street racing. They wanted to create something that was both stylish and fun, creating their own roster of vehicles based on the appearance of actual licensed cars and recreating an open-world likeness of New York City as well as London. Straying from the typical formula of loading screens and linear racing locales, the Midnight Club experience was meant to immerse its players into the world of illegal street racing. To begin the game as a mysterious cab driver, whose shift takes a strange turn upon being challenged to a race by a man named Emilio. Upon following Emilio for a bit, he tells you to meet him back at the same spot around midnight, in which him and his team of other low-riding homies will be there to challenge you to a 5-person race. Upon completing this race, you take down Emilio's number and get an offer to race him one-on-one for the pink slip of his vehicle. And after winning that race, so begins your journey up the street racing hierarchy. Now at the time of the game's release, this was a special experience for racing fans, with the fact that you were able to freely roam around the game's world, searching for competition and winning their vehicles through races. And combining that with a stylish presentation and an ambient soundtrack, you've got yourself a hell of an experience. The game's soundtrack was produced by house and techno artists Derek May and Surgeon, as well as the drum and bass gurus Dom and Roland. The Rockstar COO, Terry Donovan, had done an interview with GameSpot at the time regarding this soundtrack, in which he stated, and I quote, "We are honored to have such musical visionaries as Derek May, Dom and Roland, and Surgeon creating the soundtrack for Midnight Club. Their passion for creating superior music versus conforming to the industry standard is what makes them and their music truly unique. Although their styles are obviously completely different, they share an important common thread, the musical expression of disenfranchised inner city life. which is obviously a perfect soundscape to represent the dark motivation of the members of the Midnight Club. And I honestly couldn't have said it any better myself. For anyone who's a fan of aesthetics and retro gaming, this is a game that satiates any craving you may have for a stylish experience. While the visuals are a bit dated in today's standards, they offer a simplistic charm, and pairing that with a roster of charismatic characters, a well-formulated soundtrack, and nice mix of arcade and simulation racing makes Midnight Club an incredible first entry to a beloved series. But after the game's release and success, Rockstar was very impressed with the work of Angel Studios, which led to them being acquired by Take-Two Interactive and eventually being renamed to Rockstar San Diego. The San Diego division were now responsible for all things Midnight Club, and with the success of their first game, you already know they had to come correct with a sequel. Midnight Club 2 was released on April 8, 2003, and was a complete upgrade in every way possible. They essentially kept all the working parts of the original, fixing whatever shortcomings it may have had and presented it in an even better looking package. What also set the second entry apart was its use of stylish cutscenes to introduce each character. You get a nice feel of their personalities throughout the mini CB radio chats as well, which does a great job of immersing you in the game's world while racing.
Just strap them until your meter fills and flashes red, then hit the nitrous and watch you cry like a little girl.
And although the second game will always have a sweet spot in my gaming collection, the third entry of the Midnight Club series is truly what dreams are made of. Do y'all remember that 50 Cent quote? You know, when he said, "I put Lamborghini doors on my Escalade." Yeah, well that was a big thing at one point. With hip-hop culture and popular shows such as Pimp My Ride steadily bringing traction to the world of car mods, magazines such as Dub were able to thrive in the early 2000s. People loved the idea of lining their trunks with an arsenal of subwoofers, riding on wheels bigger than their car doors, and who could forget, when you stop, the rims keep spinning, baby. These trends and modifications in street racing culture were at an all-time peak on a global scale, and Rockstar decided it would be a great time to take their darling IP of Midnight Club into an exciting new direction, which came to be in the form of Midnight Club 3, Dub Edition, which in my opinion is the greatest racing game of all time. Now I know that's a big statement, especially with so many other incredible racing IPs out there, but what separates Dub Edition from the rest is that familiar charm of a Midnight Club game being mixed with an insane roster of vehicles and customization options. While I was a huge Need for Speed Underground fan at the time, I'd always enjoyed that Midnight Club games lean more into an arcadey nature. And with Midnight Club 3, the feel of high-speed driving in this game has yet to be matched in my opinion. And while the speed feels incredibly exhilarating in each race, what makes the gameplay so fun is how well the vehicles handle. Drifts are effortless and stylish, weaving in and out of traffic on a highway feels incredibly fluid, and the return of a top-notch soundtrack is sure to keep you in the zone for many playthroughs. This time around, they decided to go more in depth with the cutscenes, spanning a story that will take you across 3 different locales, all with an importance in the history of motor vehicles. Unlike the previous entries in the Midnight Club series, the third entry includes a full roster of licensed vehicles. From luxury sedans to spacious SUVs, motorbikes and supercars, the selection this time around is immaculate and is sure to include a little something for everyone. And when it comes to my hot pink Supra, it just can't be beat. The Midnight Club series is one of the most beloved racing IPs of all time, and with no word from Rockstar in regards to continuing the series, we can at least take comfort in how timeless all 3 of its early entries were. And while a 4th edition in the form of Midnight Club Los Angeles was later developed by Rockstar London, it just didn't have that same bad boy attitude and flair that the original 3 held. There was something about controlling the silhouette of a mystery driver, being involved in an underground street racing syndicate that only operates at night, and listening to banging early 2000s music that made the earlier entries so incredibly timeless, a feeling that came to be lost in the 4th game, and one that's been greatly missed ever since. But as you can see, we've strayed a bit from our timeline in the history of Rockstar. And after the 2000 debut of the Midnight Club series, it was time for Rockstar to put the finishing touches on one of their most iconic games of all time. So let's hop in the time machine and take a trip back to 2001 as we revisit the release of Grand Theft Auto 3. The infant stages of GTA 3 began in 1999, with the game's very first tech demo being created on the Sega Dreamcast. They were aiming to create an open world experience like never before seen, And taking note of what fans loved in their previous entries, they wanted to expand on all previous ideas and elevate the series to an incredible level. The game's development was a bit rocky at first though, with the original Dreamcast port being scrapped due to the failed commercial success of the console. They initially made an offer to Microsoft in making GTA 3 an Xbox exclusive, but was shot down due to the game's mature themes and poor sales in previous entries. Talk about fumbling the bag, eh Microsoft? But anyways, with the Dreamcast and original Xbox being off the table, Rockstar felt that the PlayStation 2 would be the best left option. They opted for use of the Renderware game engine, one that was powerful enough to handle the massive 3D world in which they were hoping to create. The inspiration of the game's world, Liberty City, was heavily inspired by present-day New York, with many real-world landmarks being replicated for the game's landscape. The art director at DMA Designs, Aaron Garboot, had stated that most video games were a thing that you played. They were actually hoping to make GTA 3 to be a place you lived in, and in doing so, they created an atmospheric and incredibly nostalgic experience for gamers all over the globe. But let's get into the gritty side of things. I mean, we're here to talk about the more mischievous side of Rockstar after all. And safe to say, this game was definitely a fire starter. Grand Theft Auto 3 was officially released on October 23, 2001. And as you can imagine, the world of gaming was blown away by its arrival. The expansive open world setting, the unparalleled sense of freedom, and the insane amount of character found within every inch of the game's atmosphere, GTA 3 was something to experience for gamers of all walks of life. But with the game being centered around gratuitous violence, crude sexual content, and pretty much everything else you need a baptism for.
Hey, I'm bored. When you gonna drill me?
In a moment, sweetheart. I got a little business to take care of.
It's safe to say that Rockstar was taking some serious fire for their latest creation. While many critics praised the game for its incredible feats of innovation, the now defunct critic, GameSpy, had awarded it for being the most offensive game of the year, stating it to be absolutely reprehensible because of the player's ability to commit senseless violent acts, as well as other atrocities in game. They had stated their confusion on whether or not the game was appropriate to even be sold, with many media outlets painting the game out to be a devil within communities, and screamed for parents to keep it away from their children at all cost. Even Walmart implemented an ID check for the game to anyone appearing under the age of 18, as well as many public officials such as attorney Jack Thompson beginning the war on video game violence. It was a total storm of chaos for Rockstar Games, but much like their controversial release of the first GTA, it actually helped them in reaching record-breaking sales. GTA 3 was the highest selling game of 2001 and reached second best selling behind its sequel of Vice City on the following year. People all over the world were clamoring about this game, and much like anything that we see as taboo, every kid in the early 2000s were in search of getting to play this forbidden masterpiece. I personally remember the struggle of this, as I was only 8 years old at the time of the game's release, but I eventually got my hands on it from a buddy of mine, and I remember staying up extra late, sneaking over to my PS2 and playing it all night with the sound off. And I remember being so paranoid that my parents were going to catch me playing it, as I was strictly forbidden in doing so. And with the media pushing blame on the game's influence for a handful of actual real-life atrocities, I can see why they were so strict. One example being on October 25, 2003, in which two teenage stepbrothers had decided to randomly shoot at people traveling on a roadway. They ended up striking two victims, with one of them unfortunately succumbing to their injuries. The shooters had claimed they were inspired by GTA 3, which led to a $246 million lawsuit being filed against Rockstar Games by the victims' families. The case was eventually dismissed, due to the content of the game falling under the First Amendment. And as the Grand Theft Auto series led on throughout the early 2000s, a litany of other lawsuits were also filed in regards to the shocking amount of so-called GTA-inspired crimes. But as we have previously covered on this channel, there is no proven link between violent video games and their influence on those who commit real-life violence. It's all a speculation-riddled subject, and I truly believe that you have to be missing a few screws for a video game to get you to pull the trigger. But all political jargon aside, this was around the time that Rockstar began to accumulate their bad boy status, a reputation that truly preceded them within the next series on our list. So get ready, cause things are about to get dark. We're only about halfway through this journey, and it's safe to say that Rockstar Games were no stranger to controversy in their creations. But in my opinion, they took things to a whole new level with the Manhunt series. The development of Manhunt is speculated to have began back in the mid-90s, starting with the very same team who had their hand at the creation of Body Harvest, a game that was heavily inspirational to the concept of GTA 3. The plot of Manhunt being set in the fictional town of Carcer City, you find yourself following the narrative of James Earl Cash, a death row inmate who is being prepped for execution, but finds himself waking up in a mysterious room with an unknown voice now catching him up on the situation at hand. This voice is of a man calling himself the Director. He promises Cash that he will be able to regain his freedom, but first, he has to help in making the Director's new snuff film, which means he has to sneak his way around a litany of locales and film the killings of a variety of goons throughout the city. It's a dark concept, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't interesting. But going back to the game's development, in the beginning stages, they were aiming to create an intelligent game of cat and mouse for its players. They wanted the AI to be sophisticated enough to pick up on clues of your presence, performing sweeps of suspected rooms and conversating with each other about your location. It sounded like a hardcore version of Metal Gear Solid, but with the game's original programmers saying adios to the project after 2 years, they ended up scrapping these ideas and going for something a bit simpler. The game planned to make use of a first-person view initially, but with problems in the game's mechanics such as climbing ladders making the gameplay less enjoyable, they ended up changing to a third-person view, a decision that was found to be wise. The team at Rockstar were pulling no punches in the ideas of their new game, and they weren't looking to tread lightly for the sake of appeasing the media. They wanted the Manhunt experience to feel as violent and depraved as its storyline, and for anyone who's played it, I'm sure you'll agree, they were successful in doing so. The in-game violence is essentially highlighted, with a wide variety of kill cams being put to use every time you take down an enemy. Brutal weapons such as screwdrivers, plastic bags, and razor wire can all be used to take out your foes, with different button presses dictating the severity of violence in your attack. For example, when you sneak up behind an opponent, you can either quickly tap the attack button for a quick kill, or you can hold the button down for a more drawn-out and brutal attack. And if the visual spectacle of these acts weren't enough to make you squirm, just take a listen to the sound effects.
Spring down.
Now, as you can see, this game is pretty twisted, and it's content like this that definitely wouldn't appeal to just anybody. Upon the game's release, it was met with generally positive reception, but as you can imagine, everyone had to put in their 2 cents about the violence. Most critics were blown away by its incredibly bleak atmosphere and just how believable the game feels, being regarded as more of an experience than your average video game. And as a fan myself, I fully agree. Surprisingly enough, some media outlets were even defending its nature, the Chicago Tribune being an especially memorable one, stating, and I quote, "Manhunt is easily the most violent game ever made. It will likely be dismissed by many as a disgusting murder simulator with no reason to exist, but Manhunt also is the Clockwork Orange of video games, holding your eyes open so as to not miss a single splatter, asking you, is this what you really enjoy watching?" Had Manhunt been poorly made, using the snuff film angle as a cheap gimmick, the game would have been a shameful and exploitative mess. What elevates it to a grotesque, chilling work of art is both presentation and gameplay. Manhunt is solid as a game. It's engaging to use stealth as you creep through the streets of this wicked city, using your smarts to avoid death while dishing out much of your own. If Manhunt succeeds at retail, it will say more about America's fascination with violence than any political discourse or social debate. That makes Manhunt the most important video game of the last 5 years. That last statement may have gotten a little carried away, but this journalist had a great point. While the game may seem completely obscene and vile, that's the whole point. It's not exactly a game you want to spend all of your time playing, but when you do play it, it perfectly matches the experience it aims to provide. But not everyone had great things to say about Manhunt, and as for Rockstar, even some of their own employees were appalled at having to work on the project. Former Rockstar employee Jeff Williams had revealed in a blog post that the development of the game had almost caused a mutiny within the company. Following this blog post, he had stated, and I quote, "It was Rockstar North's pet project. Most of us at Rockstar Games wanted no part of it. We'd already weathered plenty of controversy over GTA 3 and Vice City. We were no strangers to it. But Manhunt felt different. With GTA, we always had the excuse that the gameplay was untethered. You never had to hurt anybody that wasn't a bad guy in one of the missions. You could play completely ethically if you wanted, and the game was parody anyway, so lighten up. Manhunt, though, just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was realistic violence. We all knew that there was no way we could explain this game. There was no way to rationalize it. We were crossing a line. And on top of that, many developers were making complaints of having to stare at all this violence for hours upon hours every day. And as someone who can only digest this game in small intervals, I can only imagine how mentally disturbing that could be to a person's psyche over time. I mean, have you ever watched a movie that left you with a lasting ick after viewing? I'm sure that's how a lot of these developers felt every day after work. But at the end of the day, the project was able to be completed, but the internal affairs were only the beginning of this game's controversy. The game eventually gained the attention of US Representative Joe Baca, who was supporting a law that was passed in fining businesses that sell mature-rated games to underage consumers. And speaking on Manhunt, he stated, "It's telling kids how to kill someone. It uses vicious, sadistic, and cruel methods to kill." The game was forbidden in 3 different countries, with New Zealand, Australia, and Germany placing a ban on the purchase of Manhunt, and Canada had to classify the game as a film in order to give it the most mature rating possible. And in an even more tragic story, the murder of a 14-year-old in England was pointing fingers at Manhunt. The parents of the victim had claimed that the game's use of gratuitous violence could have been means of inspiration for the killing, but as with similar cases, it was dismissed, and attorney Jack Thompson continued on his conquest against Rockstar. The events of this also led to the game's sequel, Manhunt 2, having an incredibly difficult path to release, with the game eventually receiving the fabled adult-only rating on certain platforms, and being regarded as an even more depraved version of the first game. At this point, Rockstar was standing proud in the wake of all chaos and controversy surrounding them. With a catalog of impressive titles, you can't really blame them in doing so. They felt untouchable. For some time, it really seemed that way. But in order to soften the blow of their future releases and still keep a sturdy tough guy image, they opted to create a game with plenty of attitude and even more heart put behind it. So let's bring up the vibes a bit more as we dive into the comedic and mischievous world of Bully. While the stench of controversy had made itself a home to the name of Rockstar Games, this blessing in disguise soon became a thorn in their sides. While the majority of their previous games had included an overwhelming amount of criminal activity, it seemed as though Rockstar was looking to push their focus into a new direction and create something that players of all ages could enjoy. But in typical Rockstar fashion, the game needed to make a statement and was in need of a title that would grab the attention of potential consumers. In May of 2005, their PR team made an announcement of a new game in development, the name being Bully. And with early screenshots of the game depicting a young character dunking a student's head into a toilet, people were plenty quick to assume what this game was going to be about. Despite the "it's not what you think it is" argument, everyone was well aware of Rockstar's deviant reputation, and were more than sure that they were looking to create a bully simulator, sparking outrage among parents and multiple organizations well before the game was even released. But ironically enough, they couldn't have been more wrong. Despite these allegations, the game continued in development and was sternly released for the PlayStation 2 on October 17, 2006. The game's narrative follows Jimmy Hopkins, a young man who has been expelled multiple times, only to find himself being sent to a prestigious boarding school by the name of Bullsworth Academy. He soon befriends 2 students by the name of Gary Smith and Petey Kowalski, and joins them in their plan to assert dominance over a variety of the school's different cliques. It's high school problems in a nutshell, but things begin to go a bit left once Gary betrays Jimmy, setting him up for a fight against the lead bully in their school. Upon earning the bully's respect, Jimmy and Pete continue on with their quest to redemption, unraveling a tale that's filled with plenty of laughs and amazing memories. And while the game has its fair share of crude humor and playful violence, Bully is probably the most tame creation Rockstar has ever made. While a certain majority of the public had already made up their minds on what was to come of the game, it actually shocked most people to find out how lighthearted and optimistic the game's narrative actually was, which is incredibly ironic when seeing how much flack Rockstar were getting before the game was even released. But despite many critics having nothing but great things to say about the game's plot, winning multiple awards and even being nominated for 2006 Game of the Year, Some people refuse to believe otherwise. Almost 2 years after the game's release, it was subsequently banned in Brazil. A Brazilian judge had strictly prohibited the commerce and import of the game based on allegations that the game could potentially be harmful to teenagers. But if they would have actually taken the time to learn the game's narrative and what it was actually about, you'd have a hard time finding a reason for them to say such things about it. Trouble for the game was also found in the UK, with two separate retail providers, Curry's and PC World, having banned the sale of the game in their stores, claiming it was inappropriate for their family-friendly image. Prior to the game's release, infamous enemy of all things Rockstar, attorney Jack Thompson, had filed a lawsuit attempting to have the game prohibited for sale in Florida, stating it was a Columbine simulator as well as a public nuisance. And man, this guy has said a lot of crazy things over time, but a Columbine simulator? That's a new one. In typical Rockstar luck, these allegations did little to dampen the success of the game's final release, with Bully selling well over 1.5 million copies by 2008. Later releases and remasters were supplied to multiple platforms over time, and the game has become somewhat of a cult classic. It takes that spirit of your favorite high school film and presents itself in a youthful open world adventure, an experience that's built on mayhem and lessons learned. Bully is a game that didn't deserve even a sliver of its troubles, but as some may say, all press is good press, and in the case of Bully, it was just another win for Rockstar.